Good afternoon. Well, today we're doing a webinar trying to answer a question that's been going on for near 70 years. And that question is, was it necessary to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in order to end the war? And another part of that question is, did the dropping of the bomb actually end the war? Was it one of the causes? So we're going to examine that today. And we're going to go back and look at a lot of different factors and come up with a lot of pros and cons. But in reality, the final answer to this puzzle is really up to you. So let's get started. In 1995, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington decided to exhibit the plane, the Enola Gay. This is the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, and it was piloted by Columbus, Ohio native Paul Tibbets. The plane, ironically, was named for his mother. Almost immediately, we end up with a controversy that divided two groups right down the middle. The controversy goes on for nearly 2 years as many different groups take part in the discussion. It appears to pick up a lot of momentum when discussions over casualties, which would be specifically American casualties, the number of American casualties projected to occur if the United States invades the country of Japan. It erupts on both sides, and one side you have the Smithsonian Museum, the National Air and Space Museum, and then on the other side you have the American Legion, the Air Force Association, and even congressional committees. When the dust finally cleared, the exhibit was canceled, and the director of the National Air and Space Museum resigned. Why is it so difficult to discuss arguably the most dramatic aspect of the Second World War in the Pacific? Why is it that historians and people in the public can't seem to agree on the reasons why the atomic bomb was dropped and the effect that action had on the war? Let's begin at the beginning, specifically December 7th, 1941, a day, as President Roosevelt famously stated, will live in infamy. Of course, that is the day the Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, plunging the United States into war with Japan. Before the war ended, over $296 billion, $4 trillion in current dollars, would be invested in building and supplying the U.S. and its allies' war machines. Over 100 individual nations would be involved, and hostilities would have claimed the lives of over 80 million people. It's hard for today's Americans to understand the very strong feelings the U.S. population felt toward the Japanese. Hatred was, of course, present, but also the fear that the American way of life was being threatened. 17 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States developed a plan that would result, hopefully, in the defeat of the Japanese military forces. In the strategic plan for the defeat of Japan, drafted and approved in May of 1943, it was decided that Japan would be defeated with the cooperation of Russia as well as other allies, and that the declaration of surrender would be an unconditional surrender of Japan. And this is very important. What does it mean when you say that it's an unconditional surrender? Basically, there is no negotiations. Two essential ingredients in that plan was, like I mentioned, was the inclusion of Russia. At this point, Russia was involved in the Eastern Front against Germany, and they really had no extra men, material, or even means to start an Eastern or a Western Front against the country of Japan. The other aspect was this non-negotiable unconditional surrender. As we go along, you'll find that these two things really play very strong in the decision-making process. The strategy of winning the war with boots on the ground included the concept of island hopping, which would bring Allied forces closer to mainland Japan in order to launch an overwhelming bombing offensive against Japan. The basic ingredient of this strategic plan was this air offensive, because the idea of an invasion of the Japanese mainland was so abhorrent to military strategists. They were concerned that the only way it could succeed was if Japanese power and will to resist had been so reduced that favorable conditions for invasion would have been secured. Gauging the enemy's ability to sustain a bloody encounter was determined by two hard-fought battles in which Japanese forces were nearly totally annihilated: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. American commanders feared that an invasion of the mainland would not be accomplished without unprecedented loss of life from both sides. Indeed, the Japanese themselves had begun to prepare. They had a slogan: the sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly. This was a slogan that was used to rally the Japanese citizenry in a strategy that was called KETSUGO, or as it's translated, the decisive. The strategy of KETSUGO was outlined in April 1945. The Army stated that the Air Corps would attack the Americans while the invasion force was still at sea. It was planned to deliver a decisive blow against the American naval forces by initially destroying as many carriers as possible. Now, during the battles of Okinawa, Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese used a new, at the time, offensive weapon. It was called the kamikaze pilot, planes that were specifically developed to fly into a target and blow up. This was the method that the Japanese were planning on using to repel an invasion of the mainland. The whole concept was that these Japanese kamikazes and shore batteries and soldiers would all be targeting troop and equipment ships. Those American forces which succeeded in landing would be swiftly attacked by the Imperial Army in order to seek a decisive victory. The principal objective of the land operation was the destruction of the American landing forces while they were still on the beach. Understanding this Japanese fierceness in battle, as well as their fanatical attitude to save face at all costs, American military strategists were increasingly looking for an alternative to an invasion. With the acquisition of the hard-fought and hard-won Iwo Jima and Okinawa, B-29s were within range of the Japanese homeland. A low-level bombing strategy was developed by General Curtis LeMay, a cigar-chomping, utterly fearless leader who, at the beginning of the war, and this is really kind of almost impossible to believe, at the beginning of the war in 1941, Curtis LeMay is a first lieutenant in the newly formed Army Air Corps. In 1944, he received his first star, and by war's end, he would become a 3-star general. His low-level firebombing of 38 of the 44 largest Japanese cities is cited as a compelling reason for Japan's eventual surrender. Now, one of the interesting things is this number of cities. The American forces launching from Iwo Jima and Okinawa, B-29s loaded with incendiary devices, bombs, were basically leveling these 38 largest cities. there weren't many left. Among the ones left were, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But this firebombing was like given credit for the Japanese being pushed into surrendering. LeMay's bombers flew so low and created such devastating firestorms that B-29s routinely returned from bombing raids with parts of farm animals, buildings, and automobiles stuck in the bomb bay doors, jammed there by the horrendous updraft caused by the fire bombing. In the U.S., special operations were developing that would reach critical mass, and the pun is definitely intended. On July 16, 1945, when the world's first atomic bomb was set off at Alamogordo, New Mexico. In August of 1939, President Roosevelt received a letter that was penned by Albert Einstein. In the letter, Roosevelt was warned of the danger of Germany developing atomic bombs. The letter strongly suggested that America start its own program. Thus, the Manhattan Project was launched. Even before Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, the American atomic bomb program was beginning to pick up speed. It was not yet a top concern. Research held in Britain concluded that the construction of an atomic bomb was possible. The initiation of the American crash program began to become a top priority when Vannevar Bush, head of the American Civilian Scientific Research for the American military, found out that the Germans had their own nuclear program. On October 9, 1941, President Roosevelt approved intensified research resulting in a feasible atomic bomb. Over the next 6 years, the most highly regarded secret of the war, so highly regarded that not even Vice President Harry S. Truman was aware of it. This program grew to encompass over 100,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion. In today's money, that would be $26 billion. The great cost of this program and the subsequent development of the atomic bombs will become one of the factors in the eventual decision-making process that led to the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Intelligence agents had known for some time that both Germany and Japan were working on developing the atomic bomb. Japan's own nuclear research was hampered by lack of scientists as well as nuclear material. Germany, on the other hand, was very much ahead of the United States in research and development. Luckily for the Allies and the United States, Hitler halted most of the program when it seemed like the Third Reich would easily win the war. The Manhattan Project was a very top-secret project to counter that German nuclear program. America, of course, felt threatened by the German program, and therefore we created the Manhattan Project. In June 1942, President Roosevelt transferred the atomic bomb project to the War Department's Army Corps of Engineers. Major General Leslie Groves was given the task to build the huge industrial facilities needed to separate the small amounts of uranium and plutonium needed for a bomb. The Manhattan Project was truly a confidential program. Interestingly enough, as records would be located years later, the Russians were aware of what we were doing. They did not have the inside information on how to do it, but they knew we were developing an atomic bomb. Under the able, if dictatorial direction of Manhattan Director General Leslie Groves and the chief physicist Robert Oppenheimer, Completion was almost done by 1945. Three significant occurrences would take place that have continued to feed the controversy of the decision to unleash the nuclear firestorm. The first was the death of President Roosevelt in April of 1945, and the subsequent enlightening of the incoming president, Harry Truman. Now you have to look at this date kind of carefully. The bomb is going to be dropped in August. This is April. Harry Truman is just finding out what the Manhattan Project is about, and it's significant. He is attempting to come up with his decision about the bomb. We have a little problem here. Let's get this going here. There we go. The second occurrence, is the publication of the Interim Committee. You can see by looking up there, there's the number of these people. 6 members of the Interim Committee. Vannevar Bush is back there again. James Burns is the Secretary of War that will advise Harry Truman on all matters. Henry Stimson is the chairman of this committee. George Harrison is an insurance executive. It would be a little bit interesting. It's like if you had a committee today that was made up of people from business and you included, say, Microsoft, Bill Gates as part of this decision-making process on what we should use, say, for drones in Afghanistan. But this was a time when there was a need for wisdom, maturity, and this group obviously provided that. They had as their first duty to advise on the manner in which nuclear weapons should be employed against Japan. The most immediate of the committee's tasks, one that has been the focus of much subsequent controversy, was to make recommendations concerning the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. The committee's consensus, arrived at in June of 1945, is described in their meeting log. Mr. Burns recommended, and the committee agreed, that the Secretary of War should be advised that while recognizing that the final selection of the target was essentially a military decision, the present view of the committee was that the bomb should be used against Japan as soon as possible, that it be used on a war plant surrounded by workers' homes, and that it be used without prior warning. There's a couple of controversial aspects to that. Number one, that it should be used against a war plant. And the second is that it should be used without any warning. The controversy over that will continue to this day. The opinions of the committee were fairly unanimous, with only one member that dissented, and that was Ralph Baird. It was his opinion that Japan should be warned before setting off the atomic bomb. However, even with the dissension of one of its members, the subsequent warnings by other scientists concerning the use of the bomb, the decision that was forwarded to Truman, emphasized the opportunity for saving American lives by immediate military use. So in other words, right from the very beginning, the purpose of the bomb was to save American lives, at least from the committee. The third occurrence that happened held in July to August 2nd. That August 2nd date is important too. The participants at the POTSDAM conference were the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, the big three. They were represented by Communist Party General Secretary Joseph Stalin, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and President Harry S. Truman. One of the interesting aspects of the Potsdam, just a side note, during the time the Potsdam conference was held, Winston Churchill was replaced as Prime Minister of England by Clement Attlee. But he did continue to be a member of the committee that met and decided on the outcome of what would happen in Europe with the defeat of the German Nazis, and what would happen in Eastern Europe. And then later, on July 26th, the United States, Britain, and China released a declaration announcing the term for Japan's surrender. And the warning they put on it was, "We will not deviate from them," meaning the terms of surrender. "There are no alternatives. We shall brook no delay." For Japan, the terms of the declaration specified that, you can see the 5 here, be occupied until the declaration was signed. Japanese army would be allowed to return home. The Allied troops would actually be withdrawn. The Japanese were given very negotiable terms, but they failed to sign the declaration at first. Other aspects of the Potsdam Declaration, including an end to militarism, and under a previous Cairo declaration, the Japanese sovereignty would be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and some minor islands as the Allies determined. Clearly, the terms were lenient, especially the fact that Japan would be able to participate in world trade and rebuild their industrial economy. Unfortunately, Japan did not agree to the Potsdam Declaration until after the atomic bombs were dropped. The Japanese were actually working back channels with the Russians to try to get some clarification about the one sticking point that the Japanese were worried about. And that was, would the emperor still be allowed to exist? Or would he be tried as a war crime or war criminal? Unfortunately for the Japanese, the Americans and the Allies' answers to these questions via the Russians was ambiguous at best. It was impossible for the Japanese to understand which direction. Now, this is in the era of the firebombing that's been going on, and those activities brought the Japanese to the Russians in order to try to find a way to sue for peace. The Potsdam Declaration took place on July 26, 1945. Now, the Potsdam Agreement is something very different. The Potsdam Declaration was made by Harry S. Truman, Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek, and it basically outlined the surrender terms for Japan. The first point above refers to Japan's chance to end the war. The last point gives Japan one last chance to surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Now, this was according to the Allies, and a kind of a veiled hint about the Japanese, about the atomic bomb. Unfortunately, as you can tell, it's still vague, because at this point, 38 of the 44 largest cities in Japan are being destroyed due to firebombing. The decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki were made by the Target Committee. This is a group of people that was attended by Robert Oppenheimer, the chief physicist of the Manhattan Project. As with all decisions surrounding the use of the atomic bomb, the decision is also marked by controversy. Truman's own notes from his diary state emphatically that the targets be military and not be centers of population. However, the orders to commence the bombing make no mention of this directive. And it's apparent from the actual orders that the cities were the targets. On August 6, 1945, at 8:16 a.m. Japanese time, an American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, drops the world's first atom bomb over the city of Hiroshima. Approximately 80,000 people are killed as a direct result of the blast. Another 35,000 are injured, and at least another 60,000 will be dead by the end of the year from the effects of the fallout. The United States had already planned to drop the second bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, on August 11th. But bad weather expected for that day pushed the date up to August 9th. So at 1:56, a specially adapted B-29 bomber called Boxcar, after its commander Frederick Bach, took off from Tinian Island under the command of Major Charles Sweeney. Nagasaki was a shipbuilding center, the very industry that was intended for destruction. The bomb was dropped at 11:02 a.m., 1,650 feet above the city. The explosion unleashed the equivalent of 22,000 tons of TNT. The number killed is estimated at anywhere between 60 and 80,000, and exact figures are impossible, the blast having obliterated bodies and disintegrating records. One of the interesting things, ironic things about the bombing of Nagasaki is that Nagasaki was the only urban area that was a center of Christian religion. It had Catholic churches. 3 separate orders of nuns were based there. Large number of Catholics attended church, and in fact there were many Western Catholic priests that were there throughout the war, tending to the religious needs of their congregation. After the bombing, to mark this historical event was an announcement to the people of the United States as well as the world from Harry Truman. The less than the 1,000-word document travels the road from the development of the bomb, the size and impact, as well as the continued use if the Japanese chose to remain in a state of war. Near the end of the document, Truman throws down the gauntlet as to what the Japanese can expect. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such number that and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. During the last 7 decades since the war, controversy and disagreement swirl around the need to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The overarching reason to the creation of the bomb is not always in agreement. Some have believed and shared that the reason for the bomb was defensive. It was built to keep others from using theirs against us. The concept that we were looking at Germany and maybe even the Japanese of developing their own bomb. Indeed, this was a strategy that was used throughout much of the Cold War. You may recall that there was a strategy of MAD, mutual assured destruction. Basically, we kept each other in checkmate. However, as we look at the various pros and cons, it's obvious that some are more important than others, and some are and will be forever unknowable. Among the most well-known reasons in favor of dropping the bomb was that it would save lives in the long run. Of those lives saved, the emphasis, of course, from the Allies' point of view, was given to American lives. The estimate of casualties from an invasion of mainland Japan ranged from a low of 105,000 to 1.7 million. Clearly, this level of sacrifice after 4 years of war would have been indefensible to the United States citizenry, especially if they had learned that we possessed the atomic bomb and yet we did not use it. A second, if somewhat less compelling reason at that time for dropping the bomb was the estimates of Japanese deaths. The Japanese themselves were calling on the sacrifice of 80 to 100 million soldiers and civilians. A third reason was that the bomb was necessary to shorten the war. The subsequent sequence of events seemed to bolster this argument. The bombs were dropped on August 6th and August 9th. The next day, the Japanese requested a halting of the war. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito announced to the Japanese people that they would surrender. And the United States celebrated VJ, Victory Over Japan Day. Another argument given for reasons for dropping the bomb, that the decision to drop the bomb wasn't one person's ultimate decision. It was actually the consensus of a committee which shared responsibility for that decision. Remember the Interim Committee. Now granted, it did go to Harry Truman for his final say-so, but at that point that would be hard to turn down the views of a very well-respected group of individuals. Another argument for dropping the bomb was that the Japanese were given fair warnings. There was a POTSDAM declaration. There were leaflets dropped by the millions. The leaflets never ever mentioned that an atomic bomb would go off, nor was it ever mentioned which city would be struck by any bombs. The leaflets themselves were illegal for the Japanese people to pick up or read. They could be arrested for that. So it's questionable how many actually were in the population's hands. The Potsdam Declaration was specific in some regards, but very vague on the concept of this utter annihilation that would take place. Remember, firebombing had already proven that it could be utter annihilation. Another argument was that the bomb was in retaliation for Japanese barbarism. Very well documented throughout the theater, the Pacific Theater of War. The Japanese, the attack in China, the rape of Nanking, the use of civilians as slave labor, indeed the use of American soldiers in Japan as slave labor in various mines and at various industries. The level of hatred towards the Japanese people was palpable during the war. It was maybe hard for us to understand, or hard for us to experience, but not so much difficulty to understand. Then a final reason, or another reason, there's never a final reason, the Manhattan Project cost so much money. How could we put that much money into one weapon and then refuse to use it? This would have been extremely difficult politically. One of the things that we have to also remember is that the war, while it appears in movies and propaganda, seemed to have 100% of the support of the American people all the way through it, the American people were weary of the war, and buying war bonds had dropped off significantly. We were running out of money at this point, and to have put all of this money into this project and then shelve it would have been unconscionable. Arguments against the bomb. They kind of fall in these immoral, illegal, and there were other alternatives. Some have argued that the use of the bomb would be illegal under the League of Nations principles of international law. Any attack on legitimate military objectives must be carried out in such a way that civilian populations in the neighborhoods are not bombed through negligence. Well, of course, this took place. This wasn't followed in the bombing of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, nor was it followed in the firebombing that leveled those Japanese cities. This argument might have carried more weight if the League of Nations was still in existence in 1945, and if the United States had been a member, which it was not. An alternative to this was to use a demonstration of the bomb. Why not go to one area without people and population and call the Japanese leaders so that they could come and observe, and then show the the absolute power and fury of the atomic bomb. Maybe this would get them to be scared, and they would immediately agree to surrender. The problem with this was, while we were able to go through the Russians, we had no diplomatic relations with Japan after Pearl Harbor. It would have been hard to reach out to them. And also there was this concern about the actual, how many bombs we had. We had 2. What if the one didn't work as a demonstration? It was a dud. It might make the Japanese, stronger in their resolve. Second thing is, what if they weren't moved by it? They thought they could still fight against it. Alternative 3, let the Japanese keep their emperor. This is what the Japanese wanted through their back channels discussions with the Russians. And this is what was never made clear to them through the Potsdam Declaration or the agreement that followed. Ironically, of course, as that when the war ended, the Japanese were allowed to keep their emperor. And basically this was a strong point among most of the American military strategists and the political leaders of our country. But it wasn't possible to get this clear to them. It was necessary to convince the Japanese people that if they did not agree to all the terms, they would be annihilated. Another alternative was just to continue the bombing using firebombs. Why not just continue to do that? It was working and pushing them on, and obviously since they were going to the Russians to talk about peace, just continue it until they do. The problem with this, of course, there's no way of knowing this. They had put up with this for 2 years, and these firebombings were horrendous. The updrafts on these things would literally knock the bombers out of the air if they weren't careful. Most of the bombers that went down during the firebombing and they're had to parachute out of their planes were actually injured, or were their planes were damaged by the bombing itself, not from the Japanese anti-aircraft. Another argument was that the belief among many people that the use of the bomb really wasn't so much against the Japanese as it was against the Russians. By the time of Potsdam, and seeing that the Russians' energy was against Eastern Europe, and they wanted to take advantage of all that country and create what would eventually be called the Iron Curtain, there was worry on the part of the Allies that Russia, given unbridled access to Japan as a partner, an ally in the defeat of Japan, would cause a loss of the Pacific, giving the Russians a launching pad from which they could move their brand of communism. So the bomb could have used would be to stop their thinking about it. And indeed, there is some belief in this, because the Russians did not push for any of the so-called spoils of war. So there you have it. You have a lot of reasons why and why not, and unfortunately there's no consensus. Well, there is sort of. Most Americans will tell you that the purpose of the dropping of the bomb was to save American lives. There's pretty much agreement on that. And that the second thing was that it scared the Japanese so much that they sued for peace. But I hope through this you can see that those two arguments, while valid, are not exactly the whole story. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, I'll be glad to hear. Thank you.